Welcome to Crimson. The year is 859 AD. A Muslim scholar in Cordoba receives a message that makes no sense. Vikings, the northern raiders who terrorize Atlantic coastlines, have just attacked a city in North Africa. He reads it again. The geography is impossible. To reach North Africa from Scandinavia, the fleet would need to sail down the entire Atlantic coast of Europe, pass through the Strait of Gibraltar, a passage controlled by Islamic naval forces, and penetrate deep into the Mediterranean. No northern force has ever done this. The report must be wrong, but 3 days later, another message arrives, then another, then reports from Sicily, from southern France, from islands that haven't seen northern raiders in living memory. The Vikings aren't just in the Mediterranean. They're everywhere. And the question that haunts the courts of Cordoba isn't how did they get here? It's what else have we been wrong about? This is the story of the raid that didn't just terrorize cities. It demolished the assumptions that made an empire feel secure, and what happened next would reshape Mediterranean warfare for generations. If you're interested in historical accounts that challenge conventional narratives and explore the complexities often omitted from mainstream sources, subscribe to stay informed. We examine the documented realities of history that deserve deeper investigation. More content like this is ahead. To understand what made 859 so destructive, you need to go back 15 years to 8044 AD to Seville. The first warning came from a fishing village near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River. Strange ships had been spotted, dozens of them moving upriver with purpose. By the time the message reached Seville, the Vikings were already within striking distance. The garrison prepared for a siege. Civilians moved behind the walls. Scouts reported the fleet size, at least 80 ships, possibly more. Thousands of warriors. But the Vikings didn't besiege Seville. They attacked immediately. What followed was 7 days of fighting that exposed how unrepaired Andalusi forces were for this type of warfare. The Vikings didn't fight like conventional armies. They didn't establish camps or supply lines. They struck from the river, withdrew to their ships, and struck again from different positions. The garrison couldn't predict where the next assault would come from. On the fourth day, sections of the outer defenses were breached. Vikings poured into residential districts. Fires spread through wooden structures. The administrative quarter was ransacked. By the seventh day, organized resistance had collapsed. The Vikings didn't occupy Seville. They didn't need to. They took what they wanted. Silver from the treasury, trade goods from warehouses, captives from the streets. Then they returned to their ships and sailed back down the Guadalquivir, leaving a city that would take years to fully recover. The number of captives taken is disputed, but Arabic sources suggest hundreds, possibly over 1,000, were loaded onto Viking ships and transported north to slave markets. The political consequences arrived before the fires were extinguished. The Emir of Cordoba, Abdul Rahman II, faced a crisis that went beyond military defeat. Seville wasn't a frontier outpost. It was a major economic center, a symbol of Andalusi prosperity. Its fall to northern barbarians raised questions about the Emirates' ability to protect its own territory. The response needed to be decisive, and it was. The reconstruction of Andalusi defenses after 8044 was comprehensive. Abdar Rahman II didn't just rebuild Seville. He redesigned the entire defensive network of the Atlantic coast. The first priority was naval power. Before 844, Al-Andalus had limited naval capacity. The emirate relied primarily on land-based military forces. The ocean was a barrier, not a battlefield. That calculation changed. New shipyards were established along the Guadalquivir. Master ship rights were recruited from across the Islamic world. Within 3 years, a permanent fleet of warships was stationed near Seville. Vessels designed specifically for river combat and coastal interception. These weren't trading ships converted for military use. They were purpose-built warships, lighter than Mediterranean galleys, maneuverable in river currents, equipped with boarding equipment and ranged weapons. The crews were trained in tactics adapted from Byzantine naval doctrine, but modified for riverine warfare. The goal was simple. If Viking ships entered the Guadalquivir again, they would face organized naval opposition before they reached Seville. The second priority was early warning. A network of coastal watchtowers was constructed from Galicia to the Strait of Gibraltar. Each tower was staffed permanently with observers, signal equipment, and provisions for extended watches. The system operated on visual communication. When a tower spotted Viking ships, signal fires were lit. The next tower would see the smoke and light its own fire. Messages that previously took days to travel now reached Cordoba in hours. The third priority was fortification. Seville's walls were expanded and reinforced. River defenses were added, barriers that could be deployed across the Guadalquivir to block ship passage. Garrisons were enlarged and trained in anti-raiding tactics. Similar improvements were made to other Atlantic coastal cities. Lisbon, Cadiz, Selves. By 8050 AD, the entire Atlantic coastline of Al-Andalus had been militarized. The defenses were tested multiple times over the next decade. In 8046, Viking ships probed the Galician coast. The watchtowers detected them immediately. Local forces responded before the raiders could establish positions. The Vikings withdrew after limited success. In 852, another fleet attempted to sail up the Tees River toward Lisbon. Naval forces intercepted them at the river mouth. A battle occurred. The Vikings retreated. In 858, a small fleet was spotted near the Guadalquivir. The civil garrison mobilized. The Viking ships didn't even attempt to enter the river. They turned north and disappeared. Each incident validated the system. The defenses worked. The Vikings had been contained. The Atlantic threat had been neutralized through superior preparation, better intelligence, and sustained military readiness. By the summer of 859, 15 years after the trauma of Seville, confidence had returned to the courts of Cordoba. The northern barbarians were understood. Their tactics were familiar. Their approach vectors were monitored. Their capabilities had been measured and countered. The Viking problem had been solved. That certainty would last approximately 6 weeks. Summer 859. The Watchtower network detected a large Viking fleet off the coast of Galicia. Initial reports estimated 60 to 80 ships, one of the largest northern fleets seen in years. But the size alone wasn't alarming. Large fleets had appeared before and been repelled. What mattered was pattern recognition. The fleet moved south along the Atlantic coast, raiding small settlements in Galicia. This matched established Viking behavior. They targeted vulnerable coastal villages, avoided fortified positions, and kept moving. When they reached Portuguese territory, they attacked smaller ports. Again, this was expected. The Vikings were probing for weaknesses, testing response times, seeking easy targets. Intelligence reports flowed into Cordoba. Military analysts tracked the fleet progress. Predictions were made about where they would strike next. When the Vikings reached Lisbon, the response was already prepared. The city's garrison was on alert. Naval forces were positioned offshore. Reinforcements had been dispatched from nearby settlements. The Vikings attacked. The assault lasted 2 days. The raiders attempted to force entry at multiple points, but the defenses held. The garrison fought them back. Naval forces harassed their ships when they withdrew to the river. After suffering casualties without achieving a breakthrough, the Vikings retreated. From Cordoba's perspective, this was textbook success. The defenses designed after 844 had functioned exactly as intended. The Vikings had tested a major target, found it defended, and moved on. The system worked. The fleet continued south. When they approached the Guadalquivir River, the site of Seville's fall 15 years earlier, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Every warship stationed at Seville was mobilized. Messengers rode upriver to warn the city. The naval garrison took blocking positions at the river mouth. Additional troops were dispatched from Cordoba itself. This was the moment all those preparations had been designed for. The Vikings arrived at the Guadalquivir entrance. They conducted reconnaissance. Small boats were sent to probe the river defenses. Skirmishes occurred between Viking scouts and Andalusi patrol craft. For 3 days, the two forces observed each other. Then the Vikings withdrew. No major engagement, no sustained assault, no attempt to force passage up the river. They simply turned away and sailed south along the coast. In Cordoba, this was interpreted as the ultimate validation. The Vikings had attempted the same strategy that succeeded in 8044. They found the Guadalquivir, defended not by an unprepared city garrison, but by a professional naval force positioned specifically to intercept them. They assessed the situation and decided the cost of forcing passage was too high. The threat had been deterred. Messages were sent to regional commanders. Viking fleet repelled at Guadalquivir. Defenses confirmed effective. Maintain readiness, but threat assessment downgraded. The fleet continued moving south past the last coastal watchtower, toward the southwestern tip of Iberia. And then something happened that no intelligence report had predicted. The Vikings didn't turn north back toward the Atlantic. They didn't sail west toward open ocean. They turned east toward the Strait of Gibraltar. The Strait of Gibraltar was 14 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. On a clear day, you could stand on the European shore and see the African coast with naked eyes. Ships crossed regularly, merchant vessels, fishing boats, patrol craft. The passage itself took hours, not days. Physically, the strait was a routine obstacle, but psychologically, strategically, it represented something far more significant. It was the boundary between the known and the unknown, between the civilized Mediterranean and the barbarous Atlantic, between Islamic-controlled waters and the chaos beyond. More specifically, it was the boundary beyond which Viking raiders didn't operate. This wasn't speculation. It was confirmed by decades of observation. Vikings raided the Atlantic coasts of Francia, Brittany, England, Ireland, and Iberia. They sailed as far south as Morocco's Atlantic shore. They operated in northern waters from the Baltic to the Irish Sea. But they didn't enter the Mediterranean. The strategic logic was straightforward. Viking longships were designed for coastal raiding. Shallow drafts allowing them to navigate rivers, speed allowing them to strike and withdraw before defenders could respond. Their strength lay in mobility and surprise. The Mediterranean offered neither advantage. It was an enclosed sea dominated by established naval powers. The Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Caliphates, Italian city-states. These forces maintained permanent fleets of warships designed for Mediterranean conditions. GS with large crews optimized for prolonged engagements supported by extensive port networks. A Viking fleet entering the Mediterranean would be sailing away from supply lines, away from familiar territory into hostile waters, patrolled by experienced enemies. The long ship's advantages, surprise, speed, ability to disappear into coastal waters, would be neutralized in an enclosed sea, where every port was monitored, and every coastline was claimed by hostile powers. Why would the Vikings take that risk, when the Atlantic offered unlimited targets? This logic was so persuasive that it shaped defensive planning across the entire Islamic Mediterranean. Coastal fortifications faced expected threats. Byzantine fleets, rival Islamic states, North African raiders, occasional Christian incursions from Sicily or Italy. Not Vikings. The watchtower networks, the naval patrols, the garrison positions, all were designed for threats that came from within the Mediterranean system. The Strait of Gibraltar was monitored, but the monitoring focused on controlling trade routes and preventing enemy fleets from entering the Atlantic. The assumption that northern raiders might try to enter the Mediterranean wasn't even considered a low-probability scenario. It was effectively dismissed as impossible, not because the strait was physically impossible, but because the strategic calculation said it made no sense. The Vikings had never done it before. They had no reason to do it now. The defensive posture reflected that certainty. When the Viking fleet approached the strait in the summer of 859, the patrol forces stationed there weren't positioned to intercept a northern fleet attempting to enter the Mediterranean. Because northern fleets didn't attempt to enter the Mediterranean, the Vikings sailed through. There was no battle at the strait, no dramatic naval engagement, no last stand-by and patrol craft, no heroic defense of the gateway to the Mediterranean. The patrol forces in the area weren't positioned for interception, because they weren't expecting an interception scenario. When 60 to 80 Viking ships appeared and sailed through the strait, the response was confusion followed by belated alarm. By the time messages reached commanders who could authorize pursuit, the Vikings were already on the Mediterranean side, and the moment they crossed that threshold, every defensive calculation in a land Andalou became obsolete. The watchtower network positioned along the Atlantic coast facing west, not south toward the Mediterranean shores of Iberia, the naval forces stationed at Atlantic river mouths, the Guadalquivir, the Tagus, the Douro, not patrolling the Mediterranean coastline, that had never faced Viking raids. The garrison deployments concentrated in cities that fronted the Atlantic or were vulnerable via river approaches, not scattered along the southern Iberian shore. The entire defensive system had been built on the assumption that Viking threats came from a specific direction. The Vikings had just invalidated that assumption. The first target was Algeciras, a port city on the Mediterranean side of the strait. The city had defenses, but they were designed for conventional sieges and raids by known enemies. When Viking longships appeared offshore, the garrison responded, but they were reacting to a threat type they'd never prepared for. The Vikings struck the port district, seized supplies, and withdrew before organized resistance could form. Then they crossed to North Africa. The distance from Algeciras to the Moroccan coast was less than 30 km. For the Viking fleet, this was an afternoon's journey. They made landfall near Nikor. Nikor was a significant target, a regional capital, a center of trade, seat of a local dynasty that controlled surrounding territories. The city had walls, a trained garrison, and a ruler who commanded respect across the western Maghreb. What Nikor didn't have was any expectation that it might face Viking raiders. The concept itself would have seemed absurd. Vikings operated in the far north. Nikor was in North Africa. The two existed in different worlds, separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean, an entire peninsula, and the fundamental geography of the known world. Yet on a summer day in 859, Viking longships arrived at Nikor's shores. The ruler of Nikor was a man named Musa ibn Musa, though some sources give his name as Sal. When the Viking fleet appeared, his initial response was likely disbelief, followed by rapid military mobilization. The city's defenses were activated. The garrison took positions. Civilians were moved behind the inner walls. Messengers were dispatched to request reinforcements from allied territories. The Vikings surrounded Nikor. What happened next demonstrated the particular effectiveness of Viking siege tactics against unprepared opponents. Viking forces didn't conduct sieges like conventional armies. They didn't establish siege lines, build circumventillation, or settle in for prolonged starvation blockades. They applied pressure at multiple points simultaneously. Diversionary assaults would draw defenders to one section of wall, while the main attack focused elsewhere. They used psychological tactics, demonstrating their willingness to sustain casualties in assaults, creating an impression of overwhelming force. Most effectively, they exploited the fact that defenders of Nikor were fighting an enemy whose capabilities they couldn't accurately assess. How many warriors did the Vikings have? What were their siege capabilities? How long could they sustain the attack? Would they accept a negotiated surrender? Or were they committed to complete conquest? The garrison didn't know. This uncertainty affected decision-making. Defenders couldn't calibrate their response, because they lacked the intelligence framework to understand what they were facing. The siege lasted over a week, though exact duration varies in sources. During this period, the Vikings conducted repeated assaults on the walls. Whether they actually breached the fortifications, or whether the city's leadership decided surrender was preferable to prolonged resistance, remains unclear from surviving sources. What is documented is the outcome. Nikor fell. Musa ibn Musa was captured. The ruler of a significant North African city was taken prisoner by northern raiders who, according to all strategic logic, shouldn't have been able to reach this coastline. The Vikings occupied Nikor for 8 days or possibly longer. Sources differ. During the occupation, they systematically looted the city. Treasury contents, trade goods, valuables from wealthy households, anything portable and valuable was loaded onto the long ships. But the most valuable cargo was human. The Vikings took captives. Arabic sources suggest hundreds of inhabitants were seized. Some accounts claim over 1,000. Men, women, and children were marched to the long ships and loaded aboard. These captives weren't taken for random violence. They were merchandise. The Viking economy had an established slave trade network. Captives taken in raids were transported to markets in Scandinavia, Ireland or Francia and sold. Prisoners from wealthy families could be ransomed. Those without ransom value were sold as laborers. The occupation of Nikor followed this economic model. The city wasn't destroyed. That would have eliminated its value as a potential future target. Instead, it was systematically stripped of portable wealth and valuable captives. After 8 days, the Vikings withdrew. They loaded their ships with plunder and captives and sailed back across to the Iberian coast. For the inhabitants of Nikor who remained, the experience was traumatic but temporary. The city would recover. Musa ibn Musa was eventually ransomed or released. He appears in later historical records. But the psychological impact extended far beyond Nikor itself. Because if Vikings could reach Nikor, they could reach anywhere. The raid on Nikor was not the conclusion of the Viking campaign. It was the beginning. Over the next 3 years, from 8059 to 8062, the same fleet operated across the western Mediterranean. They didn't establish permanent bases or attempt conquest. They conducted systematic raiding that exploited the same advantage, presence in a region where they weren't expected. The Balearic Islands were hit multiple times. Majorca and Minorca, both controlled by Islamic authorities, had never prepared for northern raiders. When the Vikings arrived, the island's defenses were designed for conventional Mediterranean threats, rival fleets, pirate groups, Military expeditions from hostile states. The Vikings struck coastal settlements, seized captives and goods, and withdrew before regional naval forces could intercept them. They raided the coast of southern France. Camargue, the delta region of the Rhône River, was attacked. The Vikings burned settlements and disrupted trade routes. Frankish authorities, already dealing with internal conflicts and pressure from other Viking groups operating in northern France, were unprepared for raids originating from the Mediterranean side. They struck coastal positions in Islamic Iberia. Cities that had invested in Atlantic defenses found their Mediterranean shores vulnerable. The Vikings demonstrated that the defensive network built after 844 only protected specific approaches. Some sources suggest the fleet reached as far east as the coast of Italy. These accounts are less certain. Some historians dispute whether the 859 fleet actually operated that far into the Mediterranean, or whether later sources confused different Viking groups. But the possibility alone indicates the extent of the threat perception. What's documented is duration. This wasn't a single summer's raiding followed by return to Scandinavia. The fleet remained in the Mediterranean for multiple years, operating continuously, returning to certain areas repeatedly. This created sustained pressure on every coastal authority in the Western Mediterranean. No one knew where the Vikings would appear next. No one could predict when they would finally leave. The standard defensive response: fortify key positions, maintain patrol networks, respond to attacks after they occur, was inadequate against raiders who could strike any vulnerable point across hundreds of kilometers of coastline. The Vikings had effectively weaponized the Mediterranean's geography against the powers that controlled it. By 861, regional authorities were coordinating responses. Islamic and Christian forces in Iberia shared intelligence about Viking movements. Naval patrols were increased. Coastal settlements were warned to maintain higher alert levels, but the Vikings weren't defeated by military force. They left sometime between 861 and 862. The exact timing is unclear. The fleet departed the Mediterranean. Whether they sailed back through the Strait of Gibraltar or took a different route is unknown. What remained was the question: would they come back? The Viking campaign of 1859 to 1862 conquered no territories. It established no colonies. It didn't overthrow governments or destroy empires. Measured in conventional terms, cities captured, dynasties ended, borders redrawn. The strategic impact was limited, but measured in what it demonstrated, the impact was permanent. The raid proved that assumptions about threat vectors, geographic boundaries, and enemy capabilities could be invalidated by forces willing to test them. The Emirate of Cordoba responded by repositioning naval forces toward the Strait of Gibraltar. When Viking fleets attempted to enter the Mediterranean in later decades, they encountered prepared opposition. Some were turned back, others fought through, but faced organized resistance throughout their campaigns. By the early 10th century, Viking activity in the Mediterranean had declined to isolated incidents. The system adapted, but it never recovered the certainty it had before 859. Because once you've watched an impossible threat materialize, you understand that impossible isn't a guarantee. It's just a boundary no one has tested yet. And boundaries, as it turns out, are easier to cross than the people drawing them ever want to believe. Thanks for watching.